Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here in Washington, D.C., where we're going to be speaking with John Blaxland, who's a professor at Australian National University. And we're going to be speaking about signals intelligence and intelligence at large. John has written extensively about that and teaches at Australian National University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on the program, Steve.
Well, thanks for coming. Well, maybe if we could start with what may be a simple question, but probably not, is my hunch, is what is intelligence and why do we do it?
So intelligence can be defined a number of ways. It's processed information, it's analysed information, it's also a process of collecting sensitive information, processing it, analysing it, and then sharing it or disseminating it to customers, be it a government, a prime minister, a president, some senior officials, or a military commander. That process involves some often sensitive collection, and when we're talking about collection, we're talking about thinking about a potential threat or an actual threat or an enemy or an adversary and what they can do to you and how they might think about doing it. So we talk about in two categories, capability and intent. So what can they do and what do they plan to do and what are they secretly saying behind closed doors about what they're thinking of doing that they're not telling you. And that's where espionage comes in, and electronic espionage is an integral part of that these days.
And signals intelligence is a subset of that?
That's exactly right. Signals intelligence is one of the disciplines of collection of information. We call it eavesdropping, or manipulating and collecting information across the radio frequency spectrum, and now more than ever from computer systems, ones and zeros, collecting that, analysing it, and then trying to make sense of it, and then sharing it with decision makers in government, corporations now doing it as well, to make informed decisions about the threat environment. What can a potential adversary do to you? What's their capability? And what are they planning to do? What's their intent?
Well, let's get to the planning part. So if a bad actor is planning something and they know that people are collecting information, why would they just get on their iPhones and start talking that I'm going to meet on such and such corner on such and such day?
So that's a great question. We're facing this situation now where more and more people understand what signals intelligence and the various collection methods for intelligence are. So people are being more savvy. So that means you've got to have analysts who are now thinking one step further than the threat about what they might be doing and what they might be saying and why they might say it the way they do. But in the intelligence business, the secret of success has been in keeping your successes secret. So in other words, if you let on how good you are at collecting information, your target or your adversary will probably adjust the way they do business, so making it harder for you to actually discern accurately what they're saying and what they're planning to do. So it's a game of cat and mouse. In fact, it's been described as a bit like the game of baseball, which in essence is quite simple. You you hit the ball, you throw the ball, you hit the ball, you catch the ball. Except the devil's in the details, right? Same with intelligence. In the intelligence, you ask a question, you collect information, you answer the question. Except it's a lot more complicated.
Well, let's delve into that a little bit if we can. So let's say we're tracking a bad actor, we being a country or a company. And let's say you know that a certain number of people are driving on a highway for a certain amount of time. What do you do with that information?
Well, you can put it into a database. So basically, intelligence agencies and organisations, they have a baseline set of information, and they will then draw on that new data and see whether it correlates with what they already have, and if it doesn't, how much it varies from what they already have. And that variation is then used to make a judgment about an analytical judgment about what should be done, what advice should be offered to decision makers about maybe adjusting their posture, their plans, their position, or their response.
So in other words, if 100 vehicles go on a particular road every day on average, and now all of a sudden 200 cars are going on that road, then you would notice that something was amiss.
Yeah, so we also talk about this thing called indicators and warning, and it's based on an understanding of what the current capability is and what the likely intent is, and then we decide, so that one of the indicators might be, hey, if there's a surge in the traffic, that's an indicator that might be warning us of a potential problem. So a convoy of military vehicles, say, proceeding down a road towards a destination where there's a sensitivity. That would be an indicator and provide a warning of something that an analyst would then look to, say, try and make sense of. And the process, the intelligence process might then provide direction for additional collection on that particular question. Why are more vehicles travelling on that road? Because there might be a benign answer, or there might be a malign answer. And so having that additional information requires the collection of more information, and you can do that a number of ways. You can do that through listening in, eavesdropping to a conversation, perhaps by monitoring cameras, perhaps by reading social media, or the like. There's many ways you can do that. And of course, when you're talking about a convoy of vehicles, you might use satellite imagery, say, but you would use probably a combination of means. And signals intelligence is one of the core capabilities applied to triangulate information to get accurate understanding of what's actually happening. Mindful, of course, as we said before, that the adversary or the target may well be mindful that you're listening and might try and trick you. So that's requiring you to do some double checking and not just take things at face value.
And who has access to the signals intelligence?
So in terms of government agencies, signals intelligence has been pretty closely held. So if we go back, and I talked about it in my book, Revealing Secrets, in the world wars, signals intelligence was ultra top secret. So hence the term ultra came along, because it was very tightly held. And the idea being that you didn't want the enemy to know how good you were at eavesdropping. And as a result, it was very tightly controlled, and people were sworn to secrecy for the rest of their lives. Nowadays, in the United States and in allied countries like Australia, which is part of the Five Eyes Agreement, which we can talk about, there are literally thousands of people who are involved in collecting, analysing, processing, reporting and disseminating this intelligence to their customers in government, in the military, and in a shared arrangement internationally with trusted security partners.
So in the Five Eyes, my understanding is that intelligence is supposed to be shared amongst the 5 countries?
Yeah, that's right. So it actually comes from a warning that used to be placed at the top of paper signals intelligence documents. It said USA, GBR for Great Britain, CAN for Canada, AUS for Australia, NZL New Zealand, eyes only. So 5 eyes only. So, and that would be shortened eventually to what we call the Five Eyes. But over time, the idea of the Five Eyes came to be symbolising the close, trusted collaboration between the English-speaking countries, centred on the United States, but partnered with Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So that now happened. We talk about Five Eyes things in terms of policing, police cooperation, immigration, border protection, Army, Navy and Air Force cooperation, cyber cooperation, space cooperation, all of these kind of things are now use that as a bit of a moniker for the nature of the trusted collaboration. And it's interesting because it's trusted collaboration that's intergenerational. It goes back more than 80 years to the height of the Second World War. And that the legacy of that trusted collaboration is that we have a network of relationships and systems in place for trusted collaboration, the likes of which has never been seen before.
Well, that's interesting, but let's say something affects a corporation and not a country. So let's assume that there's some bad actors who want to do something to Microsoft or Google. They're not countries, but a lot of people associate them with the United States. Does Five Eyes have anything to do with something like that?
When the Five Eyes arrangement was established, we lived in a world that was analog, right? It was It was not ones and zeros. We've gone into a digital world now where everything is computerized and it's about ones and zeros, various permutations of ones and zeros. And it's automated and it's computerized, and over the years, those countries, Five Eyes and beyond, have become increasingly dependent on technology from these corporations. And so there's been almost symbiotic relationship developed between the intelligence agencies, the signals intelligence agencies in particular, but more than them, with these big computer-related IT companies that have important capabilities that need to be protected on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis. So with the world being so more connected now than ever, it's very hard to tease out and say, well, that part's just government and that part's just industry, because they're now more closely connected than ever. So when something happens to a Microsoft or an IBM or some other industry that is invested in the intelligence community, or that the government has invested in to support the intelligence community, there's clearly an important connection there that the government agencies involved, if they've got a red light going off in the indicators and warning capability we were talking about, they may well give a tip off to that company that, hey, there's a vulnerability we've identified, and that's where we need to go. So what's happened because of this transition to this digital world from the analog world, when we're just listening to radio frequency modulations back in the old days, now we've got a set of circumstances where this vulnerability applies across industry, society and government. So what we've seen is these once very secretive bodies, like in Australia's case, one was called Central Bureau. Well, what the blazes is a Central Bureau, right? And we used to talk about NSA as no such agency because they were trying to hide themselves, right? Now, there's been like a Copernican revolution, the turning upside down, if you like, of this very secretive space into providing a community service through the Cyber Security Centre. So Australia has Australian Cyber Security Centre and regional ones, very closely interacting with their American and other Five Eyes partners, and more in fact, with a view to helping citizens and corporations stay abreast of the challenges, because it's morphing, it's changing moment by moment, day by day. So more and more these agencies, these corporations and people and schools and society groups need to be kept up to date. And where does the expertise lie? Well, the heart of much of this expertise lay in the world of SIGINT, the signals intelligence, because they were working with computers going back to World War II, the original IBM computers back of the 1940s. They then morphed and became leading developers and practitioners in the use of advanced computing. And today, that expertise is now being shared through these cyber security centres in a way that is unprecedented. So we're more connected, more dependent, more complementary in terms of government capabilities, society needs, industry capabilities, and it's kind of a virtuous cycle, if you like.
Well, and speaking of that cycle, what if all of a sudden somebody breaks the cycle because there's a political change in a particular country, and now that country wants to go in a slightly different direction than they were going yesterday? How would that affect the collection of intelligence, or would that affect the sharing of the intelligence, or maybe none of those?
If you look around the world, there's lots of reasons to think that there might be some great disruption afoot. And lots of commentators are saying there is a great disruption happening. There is, I think, my sense is there's a real reluctance in this trusted ecosystem of intelligence to go too far away from that, because this still has, it's an arrangement that brings mutual benefits to all of the players. So even though the United States is by far the biggest player in this space, there are still considerable benefits from sharing and partnering with others, and include mostly Five Eyes, but it goes beyond the Five Eyes, bilaterally with other countries as well, and with NATO partners as well. So there's a real utility, enduring utility. In part, that's because countries like Australia bring a different perspective, a complementary perspective. So we look at the world from down under, and the light there casts different shadows on many of the same problems. And that different shadow actually helps provide depth of understanding of a challenge or a set of circumstances or insights on a target that you won't necessarily get if you're just sitting in DC with your headphones on, looking at it from one angle.
Well, that is interesting. So let's go down the different angles. So let's assume something is happening in Germany. Okay, so that information somehow makes its way to allies of Germany, and then different countries have to decide whether or not to act on that?
Pretty much, yeah. So, I mean, Germany is, an integral part of NATO, and even countries like Australia have formalised sharing arrangements with countries like Germany, even though we're not formally part of NATO, but we've got a lot of compatibilities and shared interests and agreements that have been established over the years. So, a lot of it will be that information that's probably shared through official channels already, but there may be other stuff that's been shared through unofficial channels that may have generated concern, so depending on what the sensitivities associated with that, that would then either be shared back with the German authorities, or particularly if it's relating to perhaps like a terrorist group, that we might say in Australia we might have picked up some telltale indicators of a terrorist activity brewing in Germany that maybe the Germans hadn't picked up, but because maybe there was a sub-network in Australia that we were able to monitor and then say, hey, we need to advise you that there's a problem. This guy's going to get on a Lufthansa flight to Germany in the next 24 hours. Make sure you get him, nab him before he does anything silly. So that kind of collaboration happens routinely. And so it's interesting though, because back in the day, this used to be something that was very strictly for the signals intelligence agencies, but now we've got, because of the digital era and the fact that we're all operating in the digital world now, we've now got a range of agencies that are working collaboratively with partner countries, Five Eyes partners, but beyond, including, say, with Germany. So in the Australian Federal Police, we have an intelligence arm there. They would be collaborating, they'd be exchanging information. We've got a Criminal Intelligence Commission, we've got a counter-terrorism teams in our Domestic Security Intelligence Organisation, which I've written about, called ASIO, Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. So there's a range of agencies that are looking to coordinate their own positions internally in Australia, in every country, and then work out, okay, have the Germans been notified? Are they aware of this already? Let's just give them a heads up anyway. But here's another angle. Maybe there's a sensitive source that we don't want to divulge, right? We've got a particularly good capability. I remember what I said about the intelligence business. The secret of success is in keeping your successes secret, right? So if you're really good at something, you don't want to gloat. You don't want to crow about it too much, because you don't want your adversary, your target, to then adjust the way they operate. So you want to be careful if you're communicating this back to the Germans that you've got an insight. Germany just being this mythical, fictional example. If you've got a capability that's really good, you want to make sure that whoever you communicate it to, they don't then broadcast it to the world and compromise that sensitive source. And sometimes it's an overlap. So it might be partly signals intelligence, but it also might be working collaboratively with human intelligence. So a real live human who is conducting espionage or spying on a target. And so you might be listening into it with headphones on, listening to their phone or their radio emanations, their frequency emanations, and then getting corroboration from a human who's maybe befriended them, or work colleague, or somebody who lives next door and is able to listen into a conversation to then corroborate that. But that source might be really sensitive because they might be really close. So there's all these kind of caveats that people impose on sharing of information because they don't want to blow their own networks. They've invested heavily in this space. They want to protect it. They want to share as best as possible. They want to prevent the next terrorist attack. They want to undermine, the efforts of a hostile intelligence service, but they want to do it in a way that doesn't make their situation more difficult in future.
Well, what about imagination? let's take your example of the human intelligence person. Let's assume that they're looking to the left but not to the right, or they're looking in one direction but not another. What if they're not imagining something that's a new thing that could be a vulnerability? Because a lot of people, if you think about like the end of the Cold War, I'm not in intelligence, as you know, because you are, but if you think about the predictions, at least the public predictions of the fall of the Soviet Union, I didn't read any of those.
Paul Dibb wrote The Incomplete Superpower. It was actually his PhD, published in 1986, which was suggesting that perhaps we've over-egged our assessments of how capable the Soviet Union is. So there were indicators like his work that suggest that maybe we need to kind of not be so aggressive in our assessments of what the Soviet Union is going to be looking like into the future. But this gets to a really important question about how you conduct intelligence analysis. Because it's all well and good collecting all this information from a human intelligence source or a signals intelligence source, through picking up ones and zeros or a radio frequency emanation from an antenna somewhere. But what do you make of the information? You need analysts who actually are attuned to the target. And what we tend to do, of course, and this is where a lot of the intelligence failures happen, is we talk about mirror imaging, where we think the target will think the way we do. And of course, that's hardly ever the case, because we're all individuals. We all think slightly differently. And if we're from a different culture and have a different set of priorities and concerns, they will shape our thinking and they will drive our response to the three principles that Thucydides talked about in his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War. He talked about the causes of war being fear, honour and interest. Three principal reasons why people go to war. So if you're misreading what they fear, what their sense of honour is, or what they perceive to be their interests, you'll get it wrong, right? And of course, so many times we project, and we've done this, we corporately, Australia's gone along with the United States on some of this, and sometimes we push back on our assessments, like on the Iraq War. There was a big debate after the 2003 war. How do we misjudge things? And of course, there were reservations in the Australian intelligence system. There are two principal intelligence agencies, the Defence Intelligence Organisation and the Office of National Assessments, working for the Prime Minister outside of the Department of Defence. The ONA, the Office of National Assessment, came up with a fairly hawkish interpretation of what was going on, and the Defence Intelligence Organisation was more sceptical of Curveball. The Curveball is the name of the human intelligence source that was relied upon to substantiate accusations of weapons of mass destruction inside Iraq. Of course, we got it wrong, right? Now, this gets to another point too, because intelligence is often blamed. Why was intelligence so wrong? Well, sometimes it's not so wrong. It's about what the policymakers and the decision makers do with the information that's supplied to them by the intelligence agencies. So, for instance, DIO, the Defence Intelligence Organisation in Australia, made this judgment that it's not quite clear. We've got some reservations about this. It just seems we think there should be further corroboration. But the political decision was that, no, we're going to back the United States on this. So, so that's a political decision. That's not an analytical decision. So, and if you're not in the intelligence business, you might conflate the two and say, intelligence, you got it wrong. Actually, not necessarily so.
And let's say that intelligence officer in Australia who's advising the Australian political leaders, if all of a sudden the political leaders disagree with the assessment, does that person just have to say they have to live with that?
Well, that's a great question. So we've had a number of official reviews since 2003 that have put in place a number of mechanisms to make intelligence analysis and assessment more robust and more accountable. So back in the day, you didn't need to necessarily acknowledge your sources or rate your sources in terms of accuracy or reliability. Nowadays, intelligence assessments have to indicate where they got the information from and how reliable that particular bit of information is.
If you were advising some students which I know you teach a lot of students, if you're advising some students who are thinking about getting involved in this field, what sorts of things should they be doing to prepare for a career in signals intelligence/intelligence?
So there's in this business, there are a number of skill sets that are really useful. So languages is one, computational skills is another, so maths, problem-solving skills, but people skills are also really important because we're talking about managing a range of people who are in an entity, but also you're talking about monitoring and listening in on people behaving. And if you're not actually attuned to that, having a degree of emotional intelligence, you might miss some of the cues. And we've seen history is replete with examples of cues being missed. My fundamental, the bottom line in terms of my recommendations is get good grades, right? Then that opens up options for you, and go with what you love doing. And in my case, I love learning languages, so that's what I like to do, and I like writing books. I write articles and books, historically informed books. That's what I like, and that complements very much the work of an intelligence analyst, where you're actually, it's kind of current history, and you're talking about not writing about the past necessarily, but informed by the past, you're reflecting on contemporary issues and interpreting from a variety of sources, being it signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, or human intelligence, or other sources, or open source material. You're making a judgment based on what you understand the world to have been over the past few months or years or centuries. I just mentioned Thucydides, going back thousands of years, and then applying that to the circumstances today. What is the human condition pointing to? What is their sense of fear, their sense of honour, and what are their perceived interests? And then what does that mean for where we are today? So all of those kind of skills, mathematics, linguistics, humanities, sciences, they're all in the mix, and there's space for a lot of different skill sets in that space.
Well, that's really interesting. So I really appreciate you sharing all this. I have to say, I'm kind of amazed that you're able to come on the show and actually talk about this in a public venue. But I guess that gets to your point about that the intelligence agencies are no longer secret and that they're trying to actually get broader support.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, that's why I've been commissioned in the past to write about Australian intelligence, because there's been a growing recognition that, in fact, while there are still very important secrets of state to be protected, there's quite a lot you can say about what's happened in the past to help people today make sense of what's going on, to understand how we got to where we are today, why we have, for instance, the Five Eyes. Most people don't realise what the blazes is the Five Eyes. Why are we in the Five Eyes? We're in the Five Eyes because of World War II, right? It's a legacy of World War II. This trusted collaboration, working at a top secret level together to win the war, set the precedent and established this industrial scale intelligence architecture that in the post-war years, particularly when the Cold War set in, we could revisit, we could work collaboratively, we could say, hey, we know you, we remember you, we've trusted you, let's do this again. And now, 80 years later, we're still at it.
Well, continued good luck with your work. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on the show.
If you would like additional information about John or his work, please go to anu.edu.au. If you'd like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.